Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome back to another episode on Boys in the Cave. Today, we're a very, very special guest on the show. So, Dr. Samir is currently academic director of Usul Academy, an online Muslim seminary. He is also a lecturer at the Cambridge Muslim College, founder of Cordoba Tutoring for teaching Islamic studies and civilization in Sydney, and co-founder of Three Pilgrims, an Australian-based Islamic spiritual retreat company. So, welcome to the show, Dr. Samir Mahmoud.
Thank you, Tanzim. Very nice to see you again, and thank you for having me.
I appreciate it. Like, we had a amazing conversation last time. It was many, many years ago. So I know it's been a long time coming. So I'm keen to sort of get into many interesting topics around psychology, Western psychology, Islamic psychology, spirituality, Carl Jung, all that sort of, thinkers as well from Western psychology, and what we can sort of make sense of it from the Islamic angle as well. So as a first question, what would you say are the main differences between Western psychology and Islamic psychology?
Well, when we speak of Western psychology, I think it's important to bear in mind that there's a long history which can be divided into pre-modern and modern period. If we look at the traditional classical Western psychology, psychology, the term itself means science of the soul, from the Greek word psyche, or psyche, meaning the soul. Before the modern age, Western psychology in its Christian, Greek, Roman form resembled very much what we might call classical Islamic psychology, or the science of the soul. There are significant overlaps because both have similar influences. So while the Quranic and the Sunnah provide the basis and foundation for Islamic psychology, Islamic psychology nonetheless engaged with Greek medicine, Greek philosophy, and developed a number of models and frameworks around that to address the soul, its well-being, its healing. But it understood the soul as consisting of multiple levels, maratib. The Christian tradition also engaged and cross-pollinated with Greek philosophy and medicine, and so, insofar as it did that, it has overlaps with the traditional classical Islamic psychology. Obviously, in a traditional civilization like medieval Christianity, medieval Islam, both of which or whom believe in the afterlife, believe in God, believe in multiple levels of the soul, there would obviously be overlaps, but the overlaps are increased by the fact that they are influenced also by similar Greek-Roman medical and philosophical tradition. However, in the West, something happened around the 16th, 17th century, where in the wake of scientific revolution, the wake of the birth of secularism, the wake of the emergence of an extreme rationalism, an anti-religious or a-religious philosophy and cultural movement developed in the West that influenced all aspects of Western culture and civilization, including its psychology. And so you get emerging in the West a new type of psychology that is secular, that is anti-religious or a-religious, and it shares with the scientific view of the world that the metaphysical world doesn't exist, only the physical world exists, and it reduced the interiority of the human soul to just the mind, or your interior thoughts and feelings. And aided by an emerging scientific psychology influenced by empiricism and experimental observation, it developed a very, what I call a flat type of psychology, or a very thin type of psychology that only looks at a very narrow spectrum of the human being, or the interior life of the human being. And in that sense, it diverges radically from both the pre-modern Christian psychological tradition and the Islamic psychological tradition. In the 20th century, many Muslims, in the wake of colonization and globalization, and in the wake of the hegemony of Western cultural frames, attempted to revive classical Islamic understandings of the soul, its multiple levels, and resist the impact of secular, positivist, scientific, reductionist paradigms coming from the West. So in the 20th century, with figures like Malik Badri and others, Islamic psychology was officially born. But in many ways, it's an old tradition because it harks back to the pre-modern classical Islamic psychological tradition. It revives it on its own terms, rooted in the Quran and the Sunnah, and rooted in a 1200-year tradition of studying, reflecting on the soul and its relationship to the body and its relationship to the spirit and all those aspects, multiple aspects of the human being. And in that sense, then, Islamic psychology is ancient, it's old, and is consistent with many aspects of the traditional Islamic framework. And many of these founding figures attempted to also cross-pollinate and integrate or engage with contemporary Western psychology, despite the fact that it is secular, despite the fact that it is a-religious usually, and problematic in its reductionism. Nonetheless, it did manage to develop some beneficial techniques and the beneficial frameworks and theories that can be integrated, as long as the people doing the integration are qualified and rooted in classical Islamic frameworks. The problem arises when you have a lot of unqualified people in the field of Islamic psychology, not knowing what to integrate, what to accept, what to reject from the Western secular psychological framework. They end up producing a mishmash of psychology today under the banner of Islamic psychology that is sometimes problematic. So to answer your question in a nutshell, there are significant overlaps between traditional Islamic psychology and traditional Christian Western psychology. And there are also divergences, but there is a significant gap separating modern Western secular psychology from Islamic psychology.
A lot to unpack there. So my next question would be in regards to definitions, because sometimes we use certain terminologies, especially it could be as a Muslim living maybe in a Western context. You know, for example, the soul in the Islamic tradition might mean something to the soul in the Western context. So I wanted to ask, is the soul, how would you define the soul in contemporary times, and also, I guess, Islamically? And also, is the soul synonymous with consciousness? Are they two different things?
Okay, so a very important question, Tanzim, because we do always have to start with definitions. If we want to be consistent, we have to use the Quranic terms themselves or the Islamic terms. And so we say, okay, what does the Quran talk about when it talks about the human being? And what the classical Islamic tradition teaches us, because many of the traditional scholars have explored the Quran and the Sunnah, is that the human being consists of multiple levels. We have a ruh, we have something called a nafs, we have something called a jasad or jism, a body. We also have something called aql, we have a qalb. So ruh is often translated into English as spirit. Nafs is often translated as soul. Jism or jasad is often translated as body. Aql is reason or a rational faculty, and qalb is translated as the heart. And there are other aspects also we don't want to get into right here. But what these terms refer to within the Quran and within the Sunnah has been unpacked and developed into a very interesting classical Islamic framework of the soul, or a framework of the human being. And every aspect of the human being has needs that need to be addressed. The body has its needs, the soul has its needs, the ruh has its needs, aql has its needs, reason, and the qalb has its needs. And so once we define these terms in this sense, we try to translate or find equivalent in Western terms. The problem is that when you translate from one language to another, like for example, when you translate nafs into soul, for example, inevitably the connotations of the word soul will be carried over into the Islamic notion of nafs. Is nafs really the Islamic equivalent to the Western soul? Well, yes and no. If by soul, we are referring to the term that was often used in medieval Christianity, for example, then one could safely translate nafs as soul. But the soul today in the West as a term has lost many of its traditional connotations as that interior aspect of the human being that is eternal, or that is, not eternal, but it is immortal. It's immortal. That aspect of the soul has lost its meaning in the West today. And in contemporary terms, when people don't use the word soul at all, and when they do, they use it in a very reductionist sense. And so a contemporary meaning of the word soul is not equivalent to the traditional Islamic understanding of nafs. Likewise, the contemporary understanding of spirit in the West is not equivalent to the Islamic understanding of ruh. But if you were to ask, is the classical European term spirit a good translation of the classical Islamic word ruh, we might find some common ground there. But many of these Western terms, or many of these terms in English, have lost their own soul, as it were. They've lost their own substance and meaning over time. And so the question becomes, when we do, and when we talk about psychology today, especially people engaged in Islamic psychology, like the people who know what they're doing, like Malik Badri and many others who are both trained in the classical Islamic tradition, who are members of a tariqah, and who also trained in contemporary psychology. When they use these terms, they use it ala bayyina, so with a full understanding of how they're using it. So people often ask me, can you use the term Islamic psychology? Can you borrow this term psychology from the West? Well, if we take the word psychology and restore its original meaning as a science of the soul, then yes, we can use this term, as long as we're clear that we're redefining it in a way that moves away from its contemporary reductionist understanding of psychology in Western psychology departments. So many people are of the opinion, instead of actually translating into English, why don't we continue using the Arabic terms? So when we write in English, instead of using the Western equivalent of aql, why don't we just use the word aql and build up our own terminology and our own technical terms rooted in our own tradition? This is a valid approach also, but the other approach that translates builds stronger bridges with other cultures, especially Western, particularly in a context where many Muslims no longer understand or know these terms in their original Arabic or Persian or Turkish. Regardless of what approach you adopt, a very precise definition of these terms is absolutely necessary. And without the definitions, you get a lot of the confusion that's happening today. So you need clear definitions, and you need very qualified people to do this work who are rooted in classical Islam, in the ulum, and also trained in contemporary theories and methods, because they're the ones who are best qualified to understand and criticize contemporary psychological frameworks from a classical Islamic perspective. Now, you asked a question about consciousness. It's a huge topic. It requires a podcast on its own. But consciousness, which is, you could define as our awareness in many ways. Consciousness was discussed extensively in the classical Islamic tradition, and consciousness is rooted in the qalb or the ruh, human consciousness, in the sense that, especially in its essential reality, contemporary discussions of consciousness locate consciousness as an epiphenomenon, so as a side phenomenon, as an emergent property of the material brain. In that sense, of course, the classical Islamic understanding of consciousness, which is the faculty of, which is our eye awareness, as it were, which is rooted in the ruh, which is seated in the qalb, is a metaphysical reality. It's not a physical reality. And so the classical Islamic understanding of consciousness is radically different from the contemporary reductionist, materialist approach to consciousness that you find in a lot of contemporary psychology and philosophy of mind.
So, in terms of the ruh and the qalb, how would you define that so that we can get a better understanding of what consciousness
Yeah.
is?
So, well, the ruh is generally understood as a metaphysical reality whose essential reality remains a mystery. You know, when the Quran and people asked about the ruh in the Quran says, "Ruh min amri Rabbi." The ruh is an affair of thy Lord, which means that its essential reality that comes from God remains a mystery in many ways. But insofar as the ruh is breathed into a body, so in the fetus, in the womb, the ruh, as it were, takes up residence in a body, and the commingling of a ruh and body, that intermediary space of commingling, is called the soul, the nafs. So what is the nafs? In many ways, you can say the nafs, in its broad sense, is the result of the mixture of a ruh, which is a spiritual reality, an immaterial, immortal reality, with a body, which is a physical, finite, mortal reality. And when they intermingle, it creates this third intermediary reality called the nafs. And the nafs consists of multiple levels. At the lowest level, the nafs touches the reality of the body, the psychosomatic kind of aspect of the body. At its higher level, the nafs touches the realm of the immaterial ruh. But the nafs itself is a spectrum of different levels. And in that sense, then the human being consists of a ruh, a body, and a soul, which is in between. When we talk about if you were to ask the question, where is the ruh located in this reality we call our body and our existence on earth, our scholars often identify that the ruh is seated in the heart, within this human being. Right? The human being is a being with multiple aspects and multiple levels. So the ruh is seated in the, so where the ruh touches your, let's say, your lived reality, your human being, that seat is called the qalb, and that qalb is the seat of true knowledge of your consciousness and awareness, or essentially not the egoic consciousness, because there's two levels of consciousness, really. There's a vertical one and a horizontal one. The vertical one is an I consciousness, let's call it, or your essential awareness and consciousness that's rooted in your ruh, that's seated in the qalb when you come into this world. But when you're born and you develop a second type of consciousness called egoic consciousness, which develops as a result of the acquisition of language and your engagement with people in this life and the internalization of different objects and relationships in this world. And the ego is rooted more in your everyday awareness of your body and your mind. But behind it, there stands a deeper self, let's call it, which is your consciousness that's rooted in the ruh, seated in the qalb. That's why the qalb is the real seat of your deepest spiritual awareness and consciousness. And within that matrix, let's say, within the human constitution, the qalb, the heart, is serviced by, on the one hand, your rational faculty, on the other hand, your faculties of desire and anger. Right? And so the heart. Let's imagine a triangle like this. At the top of the triangle, at the peak of the triangle, is the heart, and at the base is this reason and the shahawat, and anger. And if reason is able to govern the shahawat and anger, and it serves the heart, right? And so the heart now is properly aligned, because the heart's minister, supreme minister, which is the aql, is managing the affairs of the kingdom. The human being is often referred to as a kingdom. But if the shahawat of ghadab and anger and desire, and the desires consist of mainly two, sexual desire and desire to eat and consume food and drink. Right? That's why Imam al-Ghazali in Ihya Ulumuddin, his book, or his chapter is called Kasr al-Shahwatain, the breaking of the two desires. Right? When these desires reign supreme and they trump aql, what happens is the heart is out of balance and it is affected negatively, and it can't properly function as the faculty of consciousness and awareness. What happens is the sexual instincts and drives trump aql, and the heart cannot function properly, and so your awareness becomes very much rooted in your egoistic, bodily, instincts and drives. So this is a general map of, let's say, the human being. And insofar as your aql is guiding the shahawat, and everything is in service of your higher consciousness rooted in the heart, you begin to rise from the level of al-nafs al-ammara bis-su', the soul that incites to evil. You rise to the level of nafs al-lawama, the approaching soul, and then you rise to the level of nafs al-mutma'inna, and that's the level of the soul that touches the ruh, and you become purified of any sovereignty or control of the lower instincts and drives over yourself. And that's why it's often described as a ladder of ascent. There's a lot more that can be said. It's a huge topic, but this is a general map of the human being.
Yeah, definitely. There's like how I want to kind of take the discussion from what you mentioned is kind of connected to what we understand about just generally like psychology in the day-to-day, right? Like, let's just say someone that's just born about society, just growing up with, whatever they've been told. What you've just described, Dr. Samir, like in regards to, the qalb, right? And the soul and all these ideas where I think like the concepts you're touching on, it reminded me from Imam Ghazali's Alchemy of Happiness as well, where I think, if I recall, it's been a few years, but he's talking about like the angelic, right? The angelic and side of a being, and then you're talking about like your desires and your instincts, right? And so essentially like there's that tussle, right? And I'm sure like any Muslim going about today's day and age, they have that tussle, right? Like they want to be practicing and go to the mosque and do their fasting and adhkar and morning litanies and pray and tahajjud, all this sort of stuff, right? And from what you've mentioned, like the stages of the soul, slowly, inshallah, if someone kind of pursues that, right? And also Ghazali talks about sort of dhawq, in the sense that once you do all these Islamic actions and undergo that spirituality, you'll taste truth, essentially, right? Like you'll see what truth tastes like. Like similarly, how you taste honey and you experience truth. It's not like once you observe honey, the truth, right? It's only when you taste it. So like you're undergoing all these processes in order to get to that angelic state, which is when it comes to, I guess, the qalb, like you want to get to the higher sort of spiritual dimension where you experience those things, and then obviously become better Muslim. You don't do it in of itself, right? But then you're trying to do the best you can to follow Allah's commandments. But those are the sort of what happens along the way is that you get pulled towards that angelic sort of state. And so why I'm saying all this is because, for example, like Carl Jung, like I've actually quote right here, has, from what I recall in his Red Book, he says, "The soul is for me the guiding principle of life, something which strives beyond mere material existence," which doesn't sound un-Islamic necessarily. And because he also critiqued Western materialism as leaving modern man soulless, right? So it's interesting that the concepts you mentioned, someone might be like, okay, but we have other faith traditions that can put you to this kind of angelic state, right? So where does, like, is there a place where it kind of is Islamic, quote unquote, even though we know that the term might be critiqued or whatever, but Islamic spirituality in this case, like, because essentially we're trying to become a better version of ourselves. We're trying to, attain a better, I guess, consciousness in that sense, right? Because, like, talking about contemporary figures like Jordan Peterson, for example, when he talks about psychology and Allah, and when he's talking about God and the existence of God, he actually talks about it from a consciousness perspective, which is really interesting, in the sense that he tries to be like, okay, like we have to become the highest version of ourselves, and that ideal that you're trying to achieve, he tries to equate it with theology and God, which, like, I think Carl Jung does a similar thing where it's not necessarily about proofs outside of our psychology. It's more so about what's internal, and kind of assessing that as well. So what's your take on the idea that we want to become the best version of ourselves and attain, come closer to, the ruh or the qalb, how you said the ruh seated on the qalb as well. Is it just, it can be equated with other faith traditions or spiritual traditions that want you to, become the best version of yourself, essentially? Well, that's an angelic state, I would say.
A number of things to unpack here, but well, the first thing is, look, we live in a very interesting age in which there's such a radical diversity of religious traditions, philosophical perspectives across the world. And it's very difficult to navigate this landscape unless one has a sure direction and compass, and that is our classical Islamic understandings. So a lot of people are navigating a landscape without a map, without a guide, and it's very confusing. So I always tell people you need to really ground yourself in your tradition, and you need to ground yourself and become transformed by your tradition in such a way that you're able to then see the world through that worldview and that perspective. And only then are you able to navigate the landscape and then pick up on what is beneficial in other traditions and thinkers and what is dangerous. Because sometimes things that sound similar in other traditions and other thinkers are actually deep down very problematic and dangerous. You mentioned Jung, you mentioned Peterson. One of the things that a lot of 20th century psychology, one of the great errors that 20th century psychology falls into, especially in its latest versions with its obsession with the self-development, self-help, become the better version of yourself. It talks a lot about the self, but it doesn't tell you what the self actually is. And that's deeply problematic. But even more problematic is the idea that self-help can't come just through the self. The Quran has a very beautiful verse that says, when talking about the kuffar and talking about those who turn their back on God, Nasullaha fa'ansahum anfusahum. They forgot about God, and He made them forget about themselves. Or they forgot about God or neglected God, and thereby they neglected or forgot themselves. The idea here is that self-consciousness is only possible through God consciousness. And that's the Islamic principle and maxim in the Quran. Otherwise, you end up into the very dangerous trap of the ego, where the Quran describes also, again, the people who are ignorant, the people who turn their back on their creator, as those who have taken their lower nafs as their deity. مَنْ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهُ. In the absence of a God consciousness, in the absence of that moral compass, that spiritual compass oriented towards God, in the absence of directing ourselves vertically to God, we can't find ourself. 20th century psychology, even in its different variations, whether Jordan Peterson or Jung or Freud, whatever it is not oriented necessarily in that vertical dimension. Now, some thinkers are less dangerous than others. Some are useful. Jung, you mentioned Jung. Jung is an interesting figure because he rightly diagnoses the crisis of the modern world as a religious crisis, a loss of soul, even though he doesn't necessarily understand the term soul in the way that the Islamic tradition would understand it. Nonetheless, he is referring to, and he does in his writings, insist on the idea that religion is essential for the full development of humanity and the human being. That built into our psyche, we are designed to be oriented towards God, though he doesn't technically always talk about God as an objective reality. He often talks about God as a reality within the soul. And so he does say, unless we are oriented towards this reality, individuation, which is the path of, let's say, perfection of the self, is not possible. But with Jung, a lot of the terms he uses are no longer used in any classical or traditional sense. So if a Muslim is reading him, unless you understand what he means by the word soul, individuation, self, God, you'll think he means exactly what you mean by them, which he doesn't. Now, does that mean that there's nothing beneficial in Jung? No, of course, there's a lot beneficial. But in order to be able to identify what's useful in Jung, you have to have a very solid grounding in the classical Islamic tradition and a very in-depth reading of Jung, but also more so, a very in-depth understanding of the entire development of Western philosophy and culture since the Middle Ages, which is a monumental task for most people, and most people can't really do that. Jordan Peterson is another name you mentioned, whose politics is usually questionable. His ideas on religion are deeply inspired by Jung, but even sometimes he gets some things right, something deeply problematic, and to fully benefit from whatever it is that he has to say about these issues, one has to be able to really see beyond the words he's using to the underlying values, frameworks, and principles that the basic assumptions behind his perspective. You know, often when Jordan Peterson is asked, "Do you believe in God?" he begins to interrogate the question itself. What do you mean by believe? What do you mean by God? He dodges the question. He doesn't want to come out and say, "I believe in God," because that will lose him half his followers. He's often dancing around the question in a way that's not really necessary. It's either a result of deep, profound intellectual confusion, which I think that's part of the reason. And part of it also has to do with the fact that he doesn't want to use a language rooted in a classical Christian tradition that will alienate a significant number of his followers and his audience. Right? And he himself doesn't necessarily believe in the entirety of the Judeo-Christian tradition, so he doesn't want to be affiliated with it in that sense. But reading Freud, reading Jung, reading all these figures, there are some things that can be benefited from, but it has to be on your own terms. And the question is, the people who are engaging with these thinkers, are they rooted enough? You know, at Usul Academy, we have this motto, this maxim, rooted revival. Tajdid al-mu'assal. Any revival today has to be rooted. Rooted in what? Rooted in the traditional Islamic principles and perspectives and values that are found in classical Islamic scholarship, which goes all the way back to the Sunnah and the Quran. Without that, you can't identify what's beneficial and what isn't beneficial. Now, one of the great catastrophes of the modern age, and the Islamic world in particular, is the complete shattering and destruction of the tazkiyat tradition that we have, the tradition of purification of the soul. In the early 20th century, it came under attack. For most of the 20th century, it came under attack by two different camps of Muslims who considered it to be problematic. But by critiquing it and rejecting it, they removed an essential part of Islam that has always been there from the beginning, which is the science of the interior aspects of the human being, the science of the soul, which is deeply connected to science of the soul or psychology, and the well-being of the human being. Not necessarily bodily well-being, because that's more the medical tradition, but the mental, emotional, and psychological aspects of the human being. And many youth grow up today without any grounding or rooting in the spiritual tradition, or in tazkiyah, or in purification of the soul. Why that is deeply problematic, especially today, is because whereas traditionally, if you grew up in a traditional environment, you can fall back on the traditional symbols and practices of your culture and your tribe and your people to find the patterns of meaning and frames to make sense of the world. Today, our youth grow up in a very secular, very scientific, reductionist, a-religious or non-religious or anti-religious cultural framework. And when they try to fall back on whatever Islamic learning they have, even that Islamic learning that they have is truncated and reduced to a bare minimum, because the tazkiyah tradition has been removed from it, and other aspects of the rational sciences have been removed from it, and we're left with a bare minimum of religious practices and beliefs that can't really help us make sense of the world that we live in. I mean, I deal with a lot of, Tanzim, that I deal with a lot of youth and youth organizations in Sydney and Australia and other parts of the world. And one of the things to address this specific issue and to provide a context for a return to the tazkiyah tradition, we have a lot of initiatives. Like recently, we launched 3 pilgrims to specifically address this particular need. How do we return the youth back to the tazkiyah tradition and the classical Islamic tradition? How do we root them back in the earth? How do we root them back in the rhythms of God's creation in a way that helps them and empowers them with the tools of the tazkiyah tradition to help them navigate the difficulties, psychological, mental, philosophical complexities of the age that we live in. Very, very difficult. And you can't do that without educating a new generation of youth who are equipped with these tools.
So I have a question. Since we're talking about tazkiyah, you also mentioned individuation earlier as well. So I wanted to ask some questions there. But before we jump to that, because a lot of people will be like, when we're talking about general psychology, like I have, a propensity towards anger or frustration, and these are my instincts that I naturally have, right? And if I, for example, just suppress them, it's like sticking, I don't know, water into a bottle, and you just keep kind of filling it up to the brim, and it's just going to eventually, come out because you're suppressing it. So what would your take be with that? Because people will be like, okay, like sometimes when you just do religious practices, you might just be suppressing them, and that might cause harm, later down the line, or even in a worse way, as opposed to what maybe we know from the Islamic paradigm, where it's like, okay, we want to pull ourselves towards the angelic state and not be festering in the kind of, instinctual way of being. So people might see that as not really doing the job, quote unquote, right?
Mm.
I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, in Islam, the instincts and drives are not intrinsically negative. God created them for a reason, right? So when we talk about the body, when we talk about having the desire for sexual instinct or the desire to eat or drink, nothing wrong with that. Even having the feelings and passions, emotions, anger, ghadab, all these are intrinsically not negative. What Islamic psychology talks about disciplining these, it's not talking about eliminating them or repressing them. It's about challenging them or directing them in the proper, according to the proper channels. Imagine a river where you direct the water in a certain way that enlivens the landscape, right? As opposed to the water kind of disappearing in a different direction. So it's about discipline, it's about guidance, and it's about a proper relationship between the different parts of you, right? So you have a qalb, you have a aql, you have instincts. The proper relationship is where aql is guiding the instincts and drives and serving the qalb, the heart. Right? That's not about repressing. It's not about rejecting. And through the proper practice of virtue and akhlaq and morality and ethics, the right kind of angers and the right kind of sexual desires and the right kind of instincts and drives emerge, and the illicit ones gradually dissipate. Right? Why they illicit? Not because morality wants to suppress your instincts, but they illicit because they're not beneficial to the soul, and they destroy you. Right? So we're talking about alignment here. We're talking about guiding. We're talking about channeling. We're talking about attuning, not suppressing or repressing. However, and so when Islam establishes this balance within the human kingdom, it gives each thing its haqq, each instinct its haqq. So the sexual drive is given its haqq, the drive to eat and drink is given its haqq, aql is given its haqq, qalb is given its haqq. Right? And then you have harmony in the kingdom, and everything is aligned and everything is attuned. And why do we do that? We do that so that you are able to realize your highest possible potential of being a Khalifa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Any other relationship between these different components of yourself will undermine your angelic or Khilafa realization, and it'll just bring out aspects of yourself or you that are beneath your human dignity. Right? Because ultimately within us we have animal instincts and drives, but above that we have a human level of existence which is governed by the qalb and the aql. If you're not exercising your heart and your aql in a proper way, then you're just living like an animal which is purely driven by instincts and drives. You might as well be any other animal on four walking along the earth, right? But we are human beings, and human beings, and realizing the full possibility of our ihsani perfection requires a certain alignment of these interior components, the qalb, the aql, and the instincts, and so that everything is channeled in the right direction. There are instances, of course, where through being raised in a family and raised in a certain way that's not in alignment with the fitrah and not in alignment with a proper Islamic education, parts of your instincts and drives and parts of yourself become undermined in their natural development. And this is where pathologies begin to develop, and there are real cases of obviously repression and suppression, right? But that's the anomaly. And this is where Islamic psychology comes in, because Islamic psychology helps people better understand what the natural or normal course of development is supposed to be like, what the natural alignment of the different parts of yourself are supposed to be like, and it can help identify where things have gone wrong throughout your life that have led to a pathological development that undermines both your mental well-being and your spiritual journey. Right? So this is what Islamic psychology, a major role it has is to identify the bodily and its healthy state and its pathological state, the mental, its healthy state and its pathological state, so that it can put you in proper alignment for your spiritual journey to God. Islamic psychology per se is not a spiritual path. It doesn't deal with that aspect, but it does deal with, so remember we talked about earlier, the ruh, the soul, and the body. Islamic psychology largely deals with aspects of the soul and aspects of the body and the relationship between them and the mind, and puts you on a proper orientation towards to go on a spiritual path. But semi-psychology is not a spiritual path, nor is it a discipline necessarily of spiritual guidance. That's important to clarify, that that's what the remit of Islamic psychology actually is. Spiritual guidance is the path of shuyukh, the guide, the tariqah. That's what that does. And this is why it's so important, because today in the Muslim community we have so many problems in the community that can't always be exclusively addressed through more prayer or more wudu or more religious practices. Sometimes there are instances where there's a lot that's gone wrong in the bodily or psychosomatic or mental development of the individual that is hindering spiritual progress. And those ties or knots need to be untied. Those pathologies sometimes need to be addressed before. Otherwise, if you bypass, it's often, there's a term called spiritual bypass in psychology. If you bypass addressing these issues, you end up with a very problematic spiritual journey that has just ignored the psychological problems and pathologies, or diverted them away, but not addressed them.
When I was a few years ago now, when I was reading Freud, like the context of why I asked that question is because it seemed like he was depicting religions in a way where it's like suppression and talking about, like, for example, the superego, where the superego is whatever principles, ideals that you live by, and your id or your ego, what sort of your instincts and drives, and then you feel guilt. So the way that he was trying to mitigate the idea of not experiencing guilt, because guilt can eat you up and all that, is to change your superego in some ways from what I was reading at the time. And so and obviously you can lump in like religion or the rules and regulations of religion into the superego, because that's what we see a lot of. I think it's a big phenomenon in many ways, unfortunately, in the modern world, where Muslims that might not be, or trying to be angelic in that sense, or trying to do good, they always feel guilt for not doing those actions. But what you're talking about now is about redirecting all those kind of instinctual feelings and emotions that you might have. It's about redirecting in the right course of action in the right way. But yeah, like that's why I just made that point, because Freud was making it seem like, okay, religion is the reason essentially why people have all these issues with guilt, which are psychological issues.
I'm glad you brought up Freud, because so remember earlier I said it's important to understand, rooted yourself in the classical Islamic tradition, number one, and number two, deeply understand the philosophical, cultural values and transformation that have happened in the West in the past 700-800 years. Because once you understand the development that led to Freud and Freud's context, you understand exactly where his ideas are coming from and how problematic they actually are. Right? So Freud, in his reductionism, Freud rejected any metaphysical reality and considered that the real drive within the human being is a sexual libido, sexual energy. That's the latent drive that is the real drive behind the individual and most social cultural phenomena. Right? And if only we can, instead of suppressing this drive, we can liberate it and give it free rein to a certain extent. Now, post-Freudians argued that, but Freud was actually much more intelligent than that. He said, we need morality and ethics to keep a lid on these instincts and drives. But instead of always expressing them through as sexual expressions of sexual activity, we redirect them through sublimation. And what happens is it manifests as culture, as opera, as art and architecture, and all sorts of other phenomena, including religion. So for Freud, religion is an infantile phenomenon. It's rooted in a child-father relationship. So basically, religion is a father that's projected into the sky. Why do we need religion? Because like a father figure who helps us through the dangers of early life, we need a God who can help us navigate through the difficulty and darkness of a meaningless existence. But a person who has come into maturity doesn't need a God, because that's an infantile neurosis that's carried over into adult life. But the problem with his understanding of religion, it's reductionist. There are 100 things problematic with it, and so we don't need to accept it. But by reducing the human being to what Freud does is he reduces the human being to what we in Islamic tradition would say. He says the human being is nothing but a nafs al-ammara bis-su'. Right? And what's a nafs al-ammara bis-su'? It's the inciting self that incites towards desire. And that's your true self. If that's your true self, then to express your true self, you have to give it expression, right? You have to let it manifest. You can't suppress it. And that's the problematic, that's a problem with his whole model of the psyche. It's deeply flawed and problematic. I would say Freud is very accurate if you take that he is describing the insan that the Quran described as asfal al-safilin, who's cooped up in the darkness of their instincts and drives and can't see above that level of existence. In that sense, a lot of his analysis is accurate. But the problem with Freud is he didn't see that there's levels of humanity above that. He didn't see that the human being was capable of a nafs al-ammara, nafs al-lawama, nafs al-mutma'inna, and all the other levels of the self towards the angelic. Obviously, from Islamic perspective, that's problematic. Also, Vienna in 19th century Europe was a city where people had almost completely abandoned religion, but were outwardly practicing religion in a very nominal, superficial sense. And the morality of the late 19th century in Europe was still thinly Christian, but it focused, because of the Christian tradition, it focused on repressing sexual desires. In Christianity in general, sex and sexual desires are perceived very, very negatively. And so in an age of an outward, superficial manifestation of religious sensibilities or religious morality in Vienna, especially in high society, people feigned and pretended outwardly or put on a very thin veneer of morality in high society. But beneath it, they were capable of all sorts of illicit, immoral acts. And Freud saw that tension and saw that hypocrisy and saw that extreme repression of the sexual drive in Western culture, especially because of this Christian influence, was deeply problematic. Islam never repressed sexuality. And so this question of the whole question then becomes, the whole Freudian model becomes a very narrow analysis of a very specific state of a very fallen human being in Europe. And his whole model he believed, could be extended to all human beings. It's not universal model. It can't be extended to all human beings. And it's an observation of a very particular type of fallen, asfala safilin type of human being that manifests in late 19th century Viennese society.
What's interesting is that's like when you talk about sexuality, at times many Muslims have taken on board the kind of the Christendom understanding of how society should look like. and we've just kind of copy pasted. But rather, when like for example, an Islam that looks like it's from the Elizabethan era, but we know that, like what you mentioned, like it's a lot more different. It's not part and parcel like what I guess Christianity looked like when it was um, within society in the way that in Freud's time that you're talking about as well. And what's interesting as well is Nietzsche also talked about how because he also talked a lot about how that whole idea of when society is moving away from God, the loss of morality or the loss of like working towards an ideal or those sort of stuff was being slowly eroded, and he was worried that what society might look like without that. So I think these thinkers were in some ways, if we obviously understand it contextually, grappling with some legitimate kind of observations, but obviously like with the reductionist attitude towards Islam. Like at times, like to me, Freud sounds like a Karen understanding of Islam in some ways, because it's so reductionist in that way. Like how we're talking about now, it's not Islam's obviously not the way that they're sort of depicting in that works, and unfortunately, we have to kind of take that on board and do the hard yards and do those works in order to kind of highlight that quote unquote beauty of Islam, or the Islamic perspective, quote unquote, as well. So I don't know if you had anything to kind of mention, because I also wanted to ask about Jungian psychology and individuation as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, Nietzsche is another character who, if you're understanding within the context of what he's operating within, you can get a better, clearer understanding of what he's saying. For Nietzsche, the consequences of killing God, as he calls it, literally, he doesn't mean literally killing God in the objective reality, but killing God as a cultural reality that people can continue believing in. That's what he meant by the death of God. It has huge consequences. And one of those consequences is the entire moral, ethical tradition that the Judeo-Christian West was based on, now becomes deeply problematic and comes into question, which is why he criticizes Christian morality as morality of the weak. In fact, on that note, he gave a lot of praise to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and he considered Islam a religion of strength, and he quite admired it in many ways. But yes, he's also critiquing a situation in Europe that he's observing around him. But the problem is with a lot of European thought and thinkers is they're under this thing called what I call the tyranny of time, in the sense that it's almost as if, moving forward through history, we can't go back to any of the concepts or ideas and values before. It's almost like there's a tyranny, time is moving in one direction, and we can't reclaim tradition. And that notion of tyranny of time, which has gripped Western consciousness and civilization in the past 250 years, I'm just highlighting it here because I think it needs a whole separate session, but it does need a serious interrogation and critique, because Muslims have no problem looking backward and forward. But when you talk about the past in the Western tradition, it's always in the negative. For example, today, to be conservative, i.e. to conserve wisdom from the past, is negative. To look backward or to be backward is negative, right? To be a traditional is negative. But if you look at the opposite terms, you look at the future is positive. To be progressive as opposed to conservative is positive. And what was the third term we used? To look forward as opposed to backwards is positive. So where does this negative connotations and associations with everything toward the past come from? And where does the positive associations with everything toward the future come from? It's a very, very recent Western cultural, ideological assumption that is carried over into many Muslim spheres, and we developed a very similar attitude. But Muslims have no problem looking backwards and forwards and upwards and downwards and left and right, in all the 6 directions, right? That's a whole question of will bring us into politics and a whole other issue that we want to discuss right now. But if you think about this question, it becomes interesting. And Muslims are not, alhamdulillah, under the tyranny of time, and are not under the deterministic idea that the only way we can look is forward. We move forward, but we can look forward and backward. We can be inspired by the past to rebuild the future, which is something that the West has abandoned a long time ago. And in the process, it refuses to reclaim, so if we're talking about psychology, it refuses to reclaim any traditional understanding of soul or consciousness, believing that we can only move forward rather than being inspired by the past ever again. Whereas traditional cultures and civilizations always saw the past as a source of inspiration for moving forward into the future.
And also, we also think about Islamically, the time of Sahaba and the greatness of, we take so much inspiration from that period, from all the stories of the Sahaba and the Prophet of course, as our model and guide. So we're always kind of looking to the past to help. We actually also wish that we were closer to that time. You know what I mean? So yeah, alhamdulillah. So I wanted to also ask about, Jung's ideas, because you had mentioned about individuation previously. So in Jungian psychology, the concept of individuation is discussed. So can you explain what individuation and shadow work is? And does that connect with, what sort of Islamic concepts would that connect with?
I think that the question should be, I would reformulate the question in the sense of, well, there's 2 questions you can possibly ask. What does Jung mean by these? And the second question is there any benefit or added value for a contemporary Islamic psychology? So in terms of the first question, what does Jung mean by these? Essentially, like I said earlier, Jung was convinced that the human psyche is largely a religious psyche, that it's designed and oriented towards a North Pole, and that North Pole or Northern Star is God. He's reluctant to talk about the objective reality of God outside the psyche. He often talks about the God within. And he calls the God within usually the self with a capital S, or the God image. And
why Jordan Peterson does a very similar thing that you talked about earlier.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons. I mean, look, in a 1964, I think it was 1960 interview, BBC interview, I think with BBC, Jung was asked by the BBC interviewer, and he was caught off guard. You can see it in his facial expression. Do you believe in God? And Jung said, no, I don't believe. I know. Right? I know. He left it at that. And that's been interpreted in many ways, meaning that for him, Jung, someone who grew up with a pastor for a father, and a church figure, and someone who's alienated from Christianity, Jung didn't want to go back to the trappings of Christian doctrine and belief. For him, the only relationship we can have with God is an experiential one. And often he talks about how for the modern human being in the modern world, if people feel alienated from the religious institutions they belong to, like Judaism, Christianity, or whatever it is, these are the 2 religions he was operating with in Europe. He would often tell his religious patients, go back to your church or go back to your synagogue. But for those who, in the wake of Nietzsche's God is Dead, could no longer return to religious discourse and religious doctrines and ideas, he developed what he called the path of individuation. The path of individuation is a, let's say, secular, non-denominational or non-religious path towards realizing the self, which is the same path that you find in many of the great Christian mystics that Jung had studied. At least this is what Jung believed in, right? And because he operated within the field, the emerging field of psychology, which was largely scientific and empirically oriented, he would often make the claim that I can't make any metaphysical, theological claim about an objective reality called God. I can't say that, but all I can say is that within the psyche, there is an image of God. And if the image exists, if the imprint exists, then the imprinter must exist. But he refused to talk about the imprinter, God, directly. And he said that we know God exists within the psyche. We call it the self because I know through experience, not because I have an article of belief. Right? So he said the modern individual, because of the nature of the developments that have happened in the past 200 years in Europe, part of which is the turn inwards, the birth of modern subjectivity, and the birth of the modern individualism, religiosity can no longer be a mass phenomenon where people blindly believe in articles of faith, but they have to go through, each one of us has to go through a individual spiritual path of experience. For those who can't go back to their religious traditions, individuation is the path. That's what he did point out that an important part of any path of individuation or spiritual realization is that we have to first work on ourselves. And there are parts of ourself, there are parts of your identity or yourself that exist beneath the level of consciousness. They are darker aspects of your character or your identity that have been repressed or suppressed. If you don't address them, we call them the shadow. And if you don't address them head on, you can't be whole and complete. And if you're not whole and complete, the path of individuation will be problematic. Now, that's what Jung believed and conceived of. The second question is, well, do Muslims need any of that? Or is there anything beneficial in any of this? What I described.
Real quickly, so the shadow would be the parts of ourselves we repress, deny, or dislike, such as anger, jealousy, fear. Is that correct?
No. They're not necessarily. It could be all sorts of different things. It could be an individual that you dislike or have an anger towards. It could be aspect of yourself, your character, your practice, your behavior, your ideas. It can be all sorts of different things, right? It's not anger and dislike itself. It's aspects of yourself that you've refused to confront directly over time, and they become repressed. And they often emerge as a result of projection. So you often project your shadow onto individuals. So, for example, I'll give you an example that I've come across myself. Many years ago, I met a wonderful individual whose name I'm not going to mention, a great philosopher of our age today, a Muslim philosopher. And I immediately felt I had a negative reaction to him. And despite the fact that he was, I didn't know who he was essentially, but despite the fact that he was a brilliant philosopher and giving great wisdom in his words, there was this negativity I was feeling towards him that made me paint him in a certain light, an unfavorable light. Now, alhamdulillah, I was very quick and aware of this projection. And I realized that the reason why I felt that way is because the way he dresses and the way he speaks, he reminds me of an early period in my life where certain Arab nationalist, secular communists used to dress and speak in a certain way. And I disliked them very much, these particular individuals. I blamed them for the fall of Islam. I blamed them for not the fall of Islam, but I blamed them for a lot of the problems that emerge in the Muslim world because of their blind adoption of Western political ideologies. Now, what was happening here in my encounter with this individual is because he dressed like them, he even had a goatee like them, had a Western hat like them, and spoke like them because he was of the same generation, but he wasn't like them at all. I had projected onto him an image, a negative image from my own experience that had nothing to do with him, right? This is an instance of projection of a shadow, for example. Also, you can project your shadow onto individuals in a sexual way, in an emotional way, in jealousy, all sorts of different things, right? And what the shadow projection actually is what you're doing is you're projecting a negative part of yourself onto an individual who has nothing to do with that quality itself. So jealousy towards someone may be a projection of a shadow, and negativity towards someone may be a projection of a shadow. Sometimes you may misinterpret someone saying something because they remind you of someone who usually means something when they say something, and you projected that image onto that particular individual. So the shadow and the projection is always about something negative about you, not the other person. To become aware of that is important, because what happens is you withdraw the projection, the negativity from that person, and you realize it's something in you, and you address it directly. And by addressing it directly, you become more whole and more complete. Otherwise, you can go through life projecting a lot of negativity towards other people that have nothing to do with that negativity, because you're the source of it, not them. Right? Now, Jung also talked extensively about archetypes, and he talked about all sorts of different things. He talked about the unconscious and all sorts of, as a Muslim, do I need Jung? Is he beneficial for Muslims today? Some have responded by saying, no, there's no need for him. There's no need to read him, full stop, close the books and move on. Others have suggested that there are aspects of Jung, despite his, let's say, metaphysical errors, despite the fact that the model of the psyche that he proposes is problematic from an Islamic perspective, there are still aspects of his work that are very rich and can benefit a contemporary Islamic psychological tradition and literature. Right? Some aspects and discussion of archetypes, the ways in which he talks about the shadow, the way in which he analyzes the fact that God is built into the very structure of our psyche. Right? That's very Islamic in many ways, right? So there are many aspects of Jung that can be beneficial for anyone wanting to elaborate a contemporary model that speaks to modern sensibilities. One of the things I think I find beneficial in Jung also is his remarkable ability to diagnose the pathologies of the modern psyche. Why does he have a remarkable ability to do that? Because he's an individual who originates in Europe, has witnessed the cultural and philosophical changes and shifts that have happened in Europe, and has seen and identified how infinitely poorer European civilization is without its religious tradition. So in that sense, he offers a very interesting critical light on what the soul loses when it loses its connection to the transcendent, even though his analysis of the transcendent is sometimes problematic. And so I often say to people, you can benefit and engage with any contemporary psychologist as long as you have the classical Islamic foundation, and as long as you understand these figures within their context properly and the source of their ideas. Because while Islam has a psychological tradition that's intact, like many aspects of its ulum, like fiqh, and like many other sciences, which are more empirically oriented, they need to speak to the challenges of the age that we live in. Right? You can't just lift something out of 1,000 years ago and say it's immediately relevant today. Right? Its principles may be relevant, but the way in which these principles and perspectives can address contemporary pathologies and issues may require amplification, augmentation, and critical positive engagement with contemporary schools of thought that could help with that, including Jung.
So I have a statement just to get your thoughts. So Jung's goal was individuation, so the integration of the psyche, what you've described, and Ibn Arabi's goal was the realization of Wahdat al-Wujud. So, what are your thoughts about that?
Yani, I often, so someone who's worked on Ibn Arabi and Jung for a very long time, I often say the following, and this is, I'm going to paint a visual image. What Jung meant by individuation and self-realization is different from what Ibn Arabi meant by self-realization. And as I mentioned earlier, there are differences. So I wouldn't take Jung as, if you imagine the journey towards God as one that traverses multiple terrains and multiple landscapes. Right? Let's say you're walking through a marshland, and then you want to reach the foot of the mountain and then start climbing up the mountain, right? The horizontal journey over the landscape, the marshes, is a horizontal journey, and the vertical journey is the spiritual journey, right? I often find Jung very beneficial and useful in the marshlands, and Ibn Arabi very useful in the ascent upwards. I wouldn't take Jung as my spiritual guide at all, because he doesn't lead you to the spiritual world, in my opinion. But he does, and he's extremely beneficial in helping you navigate some aspects of the marshland and that landscape that has become barren, devoid of symbols, which is, what the modern world is today. But so in that very limited sense, Jung is to be, can be helpful, but only for those who know how to use him. That's the problem. Is a lot of people who read Jung don't understand him properly and don't have the Islamic framework to then critically engage with him in a proper way. So they read him and they think what he's saying is what they think he means, when in fact he means something very different. Right? Another way of describing it is to say Jung is helpful in the early journeys of psychological wholeness. He can be beneficial in those early stages, but beyond that, you need a different guide. Right? And because a lot of problems today that Muslims deal with are problems of the marshland, as I call them, or they're problems in which we're stuck in the muck, in the quagmire. In that aspect, Jung is useful. A lot of the classical Islamic psychological literature sometimes discusses aspects of the journey to God that don't always address some of the very modern pathologies of the soul. And that's where I think that literature can be augmented. And I use the words very carefully: augmented and amplified, not substituted. When you augment something, it means you can you add it as a complement to what you already have, or when you amplify it, it strengthens what you already have. But it's not a substitute. It should be integrated on our own terms. Now we can get into more detail in a book length discussion on this. There's a wonderful article written by a convert called Charles Upton in a book of his on the Greater Jihad, which is about the greater spiritual struggle. In there's a chapter called "Can Jung Be Saved?" And it's an interesting chapter on what, from his perspective, he considers to be beneficial in Jung, because he used to be a Jungian himself, or at least he was influenced by Jung himself.
So in terms of what you were discussing, there's many things I actually want to mention, but in terms of Jung, so Jung believed dreams are a direct window into the unconscious. He analyzed recurring symbols, archetypes, emotional patterns in dreams to help people understand inner conflicts or potentials. So, for example, a snake in a dream might represent transformation or danger depending on its context. So, Ibn Arabi saw dreams as glimpses into the imaginal realm where meaning takes form. Jung also, saw dreams as windows into the unconscious, rich with archetypes. So, I want to ask, what are your thoughts about that, and what is the imaginal realm that Ibn Arabi is referring to in comparison to Jung as well?
Well, look, this is Jungian dream interpretation is one area I think that is quite useful because he did extensive work on it. But let's go back to basics. Jung's model of the psyche is that there's ego consciousness up here, and then this vast realm outside the ego called the unconscious. From an Islamic perspective, there's something problematic about that model, because in the Islamic model of the psyche, there's a realm above called supraconsciousness, and then there's a level of consciousness here, and then you can say that there's a level of subconscious and unconscious beneath. And so when we look at someone like Ibn Arabi, he talks about someone like Ibn Arabi, he talks about the imaginal realm, but that's a realm above the level of consciousness, in a realm of light above, right? Jung places the dream world in the realm and the archetypal world in a realm below. So there's a very problematic structure of the psyche in Jung that we need not adopt. But being aware of this is important because in the Islamic tradition, we distinguish between different types of dreams. There are dreams that come from above, there are dreams that come from below, right? Both speak in the language of symbols. Jung doesn't always make a distinction between dreams from above and dreams from below. He seems to lump them together in the same realm called the unconscious. So there are certain types of dreams and experiences that we can say in Jung that he talks about that are similar to what Ibn Arabi talks about in terms of the imaginal realm. But there are a lot of dreams and experiences that Jung talks about that actually don't belong to the higher realms, but actually belong to a lower realm, right? So one of the errors of Jung, many years ago, scholars try to kind of identify some of the errors in Jung and Freud. And they pointed out that one of the problems with Freud is he has a tendency of always reducing everything that's transcendent to something that's dark, subconscious, and low, right? The problem with Jung is the exact opposite. Sometimes he elevates experiences that are low and tries to make them transcendent. And that's a problem. So if you bear that in mind, you understand that not every dream Jung talks about is actually a real dream in the sense of the highest possible dream. It may be a very low type of dream. The second thing is, though, what is beneficial in Jung is his understanding of dreams as symbols to be interpreted. This is where I think his dream analysis and approach to dreams is radically better than Freud's. And this is where I think it's quite consistent with some of the dream analysis you find in the Islamic tradition. As long as you bear in mind that we have to make these distinctions between different types of dreams and different levels of dreams, and not confuse them, as Jung often does. One of the things about Jung that he does that I think can be beneficial in contemporary Islamic dream analysis, so putting all these caveats aside and all these critical comments aside, one of the things that Jung has done that I think many in the classical Islamic tradition have not done when it comes to dream interpretation is Jung said the following. He said, look, if there are certain types of dreams that come from the archetypal world, the archetypal realm is common to all human beings in all cultures. You can call it the fitraic, I call it the fitraic realm. It's common to all peoples, all cultures, everywhere. And these archetypes have manifested in all cultures around the world and in all religions around the world, right? So if someone has a dream that is from the collective unconscious or from this archetypal world, we can utilize the symbols and understandings of these symbols in world religions and world cultures to amplify the meaning of these dreams. Right? And this is where his work is quite interesting, because if that is the case, then we can, as Muslims, draw on the various symbols from around the world to sometimes interpret the meanings of certain types of dreams. Again, this requires a whole book and a whole session, a separate session. But in this particular aspect, I think Jung is developed a line of research that was interesting, that it has precedence in the Islamic civilizational sphere, but it wasn't as elaborated as Jung developed it. Because obviously the comparative literature on religions and world cultures available to Jung was much more extensive than that which was available to many medieval Muslim thinkers. So in a nutshell, yes, there are certain aspects of Jung's dream interpretation analysis that are beneficial. Certain aspects are problematic. Certain aspects where he innovated in directions that I think we can find very beneficial. And I this is my personal opinion. Contemporary Islamic dream analysis can benefit immensely from Jung on dream interpretation, as long as we are aware of all these problems in his model, in his metaphysics, and in his structure of the psyche. So I would say, in spite of or despite all his errors, there's still something very beneficial in his dream analysis, his method.
It's interesting. So I guess if we're talking about Ibn Arabi's imaginal realm, and the whole idea of like from the Jungian perspective that you mentioned, that we're trying to make sense of these dreams and what these symbols are. There's that implicit assumption there, I guess, from a metaphysical perspective, that they mean something. There's something more to it than that, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking that from a kind of reductionist, maybe quote unquote atheistic paradigm, technically speaking, like nothing should even mean anything, right? Because it's just like meanings and words and images that you have. So I think why do you think that Jung has that assumption that these mean more than what they say, as opposed to, just some other,
Well, I think Jung was a lot more open to what the data was telling him than Freud was. Freud was a person, because, Jung was a student of Freud and he broke away from him. Freud was very much of a single frame of mind, and he wanted validation for his theories from the data that he looked at. Jung was a lot more, he listened a lot more to the data in front of him, and he said the literature from around the world gives us compelling evidence that there is a God, that religion is a path for individuation, an important one, and that there are archetypes, and they are found in all cultures that manifest differently. So he was much more open to what the literature was telling him, in a sense. And perhaps because his father was a pastor himself and he comes from a pious family, his father, read Arabic, and his father was familiar with Islam. And he read a lot of Semitic languages. So he comes from a scholarly family background that was deeply Christian. So in that sense, Jung then, because Jung studied extensively comparative religions and cultures from around the world, and then he also studied alchemy and the medieval Christian mystical tradition and esoteric tradition, he found there overwhelming evidence for these realities, these transcendent realities that we often talk about. Now, the thing is with Ibn Arabi, though, is not everything that Jung qualified as a spiritual experience or a dream qualifies as belonging to the imaginal world that Ibn Arabi talked about. For Ibn Arabi, the imaginal world is a realm above, and it's of certain types of experiences. Right? But what they share in common is, yes, Jung did believe in a certain imaginal realm, but he was confused about it, and he lumped it together with the lower parts of the psyche in an unconscious world. Right? But his understanding of symbols and symbolism was very interesting and very much in line with Ibn Arabi. So I take for me the Islamic tradition as the ma'yar, right? The measure. And I read Jung. Does he fit or not? If he doesn't fit, I critique and reject. If he does fit, I can amplify and accept. Right? But what Jung found was that the archetypes in the collective unconscious, or the realm beyond consciousness, are always expressed in a language of symbols, because they can't manifest themselves except in that way, right? Which is very similar to Ibn Arabi's ideas that the realities in the higher realms can only manifest and clothe themselves in certain forms and symbols in the imaginal realm. But in order to get to the bottom of it, you have to interpret it. Right? So in Islamic tradition, the science of ta'wil means to return something back to its origin, or ta'bir, to cross over from the outer to the inner, the zahir to the batin. Ta'bir al-manam is the official term for dream interpretation in Islam, right? To cross over from the symbol to the meaning behind the symbol. Ta'bir, to cross over, like crossing a bridge. In that sense, the language of symbolism in both Jung and Ibn Arabi is mutually complementary, right? But Ibn Arabi usually always talks about these higher spiritual experiences, which Jung rarely touches upon. I mean, he alludes to them, and even the things that Jung talks about as transcendent are really not as transcendent as he claims they are. Even the Red Book, for example, is an interesting recital, a narrative about his soul's journey. But it's questionable whether he is traveling in the highest imaginal world. It's most likely that he's traveling within a lower imaginal world of the psyche rather than a higher spiritual imaginal world. Because even in ʿalam al-khayal, there are maratib, there are levels, right? So we have to read it with a grain of salt and try to contextualize it in that sense. In his encounter with various figures within his own journey, how do we discern and determine whether they were really spiritual beings or not? Islamic tradition provides some criteria for this. Jung, one of the biggest confusions in Jung, I think, is he considered any symbol from the collective unconscious to be numinous. Right? This is a term he borrows from the historian of religion, Rudolf Otto, who talks about the numinous quality of religious symbols. They are saturated with a presence and numinosity or power about them that fills you with awe of a divine presence. Right? So he considered he wasn't able to always discern whether these things were actually numinous, coming from the divine, or whether they're coming from your own psyche or some other place. This is where he becomes problematic. But the language of symbols is the same. Right? The language of symbols is the same. And that's where he intersects with the Islamic tradition very interestingly. And why does he do this? Because he's studying mystical sources. He's studying esoteric traditions. He's studying classical Christian Greek thinkers. He's studying also Arabic alchemy. Jung spent a significant portion of his life reading Arabic alchemy, which was translated into Latin. And he gets a lot of his language of the psyche, a lot of the language on individuation, and a lot of the language on interpretation of symbols from alchemy.
SubhanAllah. And I know you've been so generous with your time, so I'll ask one last question, inshallah. It's a bit of a heavy one, though. So, does Ibn Arabi's Wahdat al-Wujud offer a powerful antidote to the modern materialist mindset, which sees humans as disconnected from the sacred cosmos? Because, like you mentioned, ta'wil. So Ibn Arabi obviously talks about like symbolic interpretation, sees every phenomenon as a sign or an ayah from Allah. So how does this differ from Jung's archetypes of Freud's symbols as repressed desires?
Well, there's 5 questions there, so we have to maybe identify one of them. It's a huge topic. Maybe let me address the first one and end on that one, because it's an interesting end note. I do think that the complexity, comprehensiveness, and sheer scale of Ibn Arabi's vision of reality, which is rooted in the Quran, and where he tries to unpack the full meaning of unity, tawheed, and oneness, is a metaphysical and spiritual system that is capable of addressing a lot of the issues, questions, whether philosophical, cultural, existential, and psychological, that we suffer through in the modern, postmodern age. Maybe a whole session on that could be at some point in the future. But Ibn Arabi, look, technically Ibn Arabi didn't coin the term Wahdat al-Wujud. It was his student Sadr al-Din al-Qunawi who coined the term. So he never mentions it not a single time in any of his works, Wahdat al-Wujud. But what is meant by it often by his students is often been misunderstood by his critics. And the idea is of Wahdat al-Wujud is that ultimately the only reality is the reality of divine oneness. And now what that means, we would have to unpack. But the sweeping, his sweeping vision of how to understand the multiplicity of reality and how that relates to the unity and oneness of the divine principle, how you relate the sheer diversity of the human race to the oneness of the single father, Adam, the diversity of cultural traditions and religions to the ultimate underlying reality of a single deen, Islam. All this aspect of multiplicity and diversity and how it relates to oneness and unity has not been articulated with such comprehensiveness and beauty as it has been in Ibn Arabi. So it touches on all sorts of subjects today that we deem absolutely necessary and thorny questions today. Pluralism, inclusivity, philosophy, consciousness, levels of reality, the journey of the soul to God in an age of postmodern relativism and confusion. All these problems and issues can be neatly and beautifully addressed by his vision. I don't call it a system because it's not a system. It's a beautiful vision of reality as it is. You know, the Prophet ﷺ used to say, Allahumma arina al-ashya'a kama hiya. Oh Allah, show us things as they really are. And how are they really? There are one, yet many. And how the many is related to the one is what his whole vision unpacks and unfurls.
Yes, well, there's definitely so much to unpack there. Maybe for another episode, inshallah, with Ibn Arabi's, thoughts and ideas. So I appreciate your time coming on the show, inshallah. We also, unpack so much about Carl Jung. I think it definitely helped the audience, and sort of, especially like why I wanted to talk about it is because someone like Jordan Peterson is known in this day and age, and he does refer to Carl Jung. So a lot of the concepts and ideas that he does mention now, I think for a Muslim audience, especially when we're talking about kind of the Islamic spirituality side and the Islamic the Islamic theology as well, it's like it gives us that kind of understanding in order to see where his ideas are coming from, why he has these ideas even, and inshallah kind of equip us to navigate other sort of terrain. So appreciate your time. I know that I think you're going traveling soon, so safe travels, inshallah. Allah protect you and everything, and
thank you,
enjoy your travels and stuff. But I don't know if you had any final thoughts before we wrap up.
Wallahi, I think my general thought is we need more of these kind of podcast sessions, Tanzeen, to unpack, maybe session dedicated to specific themes and to unpack these things. Because, yes, we can give talks in the community. Yes, at Three Pilgrims, we do these retreats on these subjects. Yes, you can write a book. But I think these kind of podcasts that can reach youth and people in their cars, in their homes, while they're traveling, are extremely important. Because we do. One of the things I think I find beneficial of Jordan Peterson, put his politics aside and put his kind of blind spots in relation to Islam aside, his ability to communicate complex ideas from the Judeo-Christian tradition through the language of Jung makes it accessible and meaningful and relevant to the lives of Westerners today. If we can have more of these types of sessions with individuals who have this ability to translate the insights of the classical Islamic tradition and able to articulate it using a language that makes it relevant to the immediate existential philosophical concerns of contemporary Muslim youth, then we need more of this. And I urge you to seek out some of these individuals, host them on your program, so we can have a rich discourse on reviving the Islamic spirit and soul today, inshallah. Barakallahu fikum. Thank you for having me. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
So yeah, appreciate, I'm happy to have you on every week or so because we have these kind of interesting discussions as well. So alhamdulillah, yeah, for sure. With Jordan Peterson, definitely even the many ideas that are just taken for granted when it comes to Westerners and who are leaning towards that agnosticism or atheistic side, like what you mentioned about how he communicated. Even when I was watching one of his videos, he was having dialogues with I think 30 university students about Christianity versus atheism or whatever it was. And he communicated the idea of consciousness in the way that we were talking about the angelic state that we're trying to achieve, and then he kind of inserted God into that picture that made you kind of think that, okay, this is probably the first time when kind of agnostic crowd is hearing about these kind of ideas and concepts. So what you mentioned to, inshallah, as a community, we keep doing that and striving to, put as much content as possible in order to, really get out our perspectives and, hopefully, educate. And even for myself, I'm always learning, alhamdulillah, with every guest I have. So it's about, inshallah, we just keep learning and growing as a community. So I'll wrap it up there, inshallah. So for our listeners, thank you for your attention. So if you want to check us out on our social medias, check us out on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. We're on YouTube. Make sure to subscribe. We're on Spotify and iTunes as well. So give us a 5-star ratings, inshallah. So from our special guest, Dr. Samir, wish you the best. This is Tanzim signing off. Assalamu alaikum.